Late at night, America can look deceptively calm. The television still murmurs about markets, elections, inflation, distant wars, storms offshore, and the endless parade of familiar headlines. Porch lights still glow across quiet neighborhoods. Cars still sit in driveways. Traffic still hums through the city. On the surface, nothing appears broken beyond repair. And yet sometimes, history does not announce itself with sirens. Sometimes it begins with a feeling, a heaviness in the air, a silence that feels too complete, a sense that the country is standing on something unstable even while daily life keeps moving. This is not a claim of certainty. It is not a prophecy presented as fact. It is a story built from old warnings, modern anxieties, and a question that has haunted every civilization at the edge of change. What happens when a nation looks strong from a distance, but underneath the surface, the foundations are already giving way? Some people search for answers in economics, some in politics, some in military power. Others turn to older voices, mystics, seers, and forgotten interpreters of history. Men and women who believe that collapse begins in the moral and spiritual life of a people long before it reaches the streets. And according to one modern interpreter, Aphian Hale, the year 2026 is not the end of the world, but it may be a test, a filter, and what passes through that filter may not be the America people thought they knew. Aphian Hale was not introduced to the public as a preacher, a politician, or a celebrity prophet. He was known as a quiet researcher, someone obsessed with patterns, symbolism, and the way nations fracture under stress. His study walls were covered with maps, weather records, infrastructure notes, old spiritual texts, and hand-marked timelines. In the middle of it all, one year kept appearing again and again. Hale did not claim to invent the warning. He claimed to be tracing it. In his view, history leaves echoes. Every age produces its own language for danger. In one century, the message comes through scripture. In another, through military intelligence. In another, through economics, climate science, or social unrest. And sometimes, he said, these warnings begin to overlap so perfectly that even skeptics should stop and pay attention. He studied older American visionaries, especially the tradition of spiritual readers who believed civilizations rise and fall according to more than money and power. Whether one takes those readings literally or not is beside the point. Hale's argument was simpler and more unsettling. A nation can survive external enemies for a very long time. It can survive recessions. It can survive scandal. What it struggles to survive is internal decay disguised as normalcy. Once trust collapses, institutions weaken. Once institutions weaken, fear fills the gap. And once fear becomes the organizing principle of public life, almost any shock, natural, economic, political, technological, can trigger a chain reaction. That, Hale believed, was the real warning behind 2026. Not magic, not superstition, a convergence. Hale often described the previous year not as a collapse, but as an operation. America, in his words, had already been opened up. The outer skin, its confidence, spectacle, slogans, and polished surfaces had been cut through. Beneath that polished layer lay exposed nerves, distrust, exhaustion, resentment, fragility, and the deep fatigue of a society that had spent too long pretending it was not wounded. He compared it to a patient leaving surgery too early. The body may still stand, it may even walk, but standing is not healing. Cities still function, offices still open, planes still land, grocery stores still stock their shelves. The digital machinery of daily life keeps turning, but millions of people move through it emotionally depleted, spiritually isolated, and increasingly suspicious of one another. You can see it in crowded trains where no one makes eye contact, in homes where the news never turns off, in families divided not just by opinion, but by reality itself, in neighborhoods where people still live close together, but no longer feel connected. Hale believed that this was the dangerous stage, not the explosion, but the exposure. Because once a society is cut open, it cannot absorb another major blow the way it once could. A disaster that might have been survivable 10 years earlier becomes something else entirely when the public mind is already overstressed, fragmented, and primed for panic. That is why he called 2026 a double danger, not because one event would arrive, but because several might, and because a weakened nation may not know how to distinguish emergency from breakdown. According to Hale's model, America's greatest danger is not one single catastrophe. It is overlap. A flood during a communications failure, a blackout during a supply shortage, a heat emergency during political unrest, a local disaster amplified by nationwide confusion. He warned that people often imagine catastrophe in clean cinematic terms. One storm, one fire, one earthquake, one villain. But reality is uglier. Real crisis arrives in layers. One weakness triggers another. Systems that look separate on paper, food, roads, medicine, information, trust, turn out to be tightly connected. When one breaks, the pressure transfers. A storm damages roads. Roads delay aid. Delayed aid empties pharmacies. Empty pharmacies deepen fear. Fear breeds rumor. Rumor shatters trust. And once trust shatters, communities begin to behave as if scarcity is permanent, even before it is. That is when the emotional disaster can become more dangerous than the physical one. A house may still be standing. A wallet may still contain cash. A phone may still have a signal. But none of those things matter if nobody believes the information. The stores are empty, the roads are blocked, and neighbors begin to treat one another as threats rather than allies. Hale divided the danger into two fronts. One front was material, land instability, flood corridors, extreme heat, crop pressure, infrastructure stress. The other was human, panic, misinformation, opportunists, digital manipulation, emotional exhaustion, and the slow disappearance of social trust. In his words, a nation does not break only when buildings fall. It breaks when ordinary people stop believing they can get through hardship together. That was the deeper disaster. Hale's maps were never presented as official forecasts. They were interpretive, symbolic, and cautionary. Still, they were detailed. He marked the northern interior and Appalachian regions as quietly unstable, not because cameras would be there first, but because old extraction zones, brittle hillsides, neglected infrastructure, and communities built over long-hidden weaknesses could turn ordinary conditions into sudden failure. He marked central and southeastern lowlands as water traps, places where flood, drainage pressure, river overflow, and storm surge could converge in ways that left families stranded before they understood how quickly escape routes were disappearing. He marked parts of the American South and agricultural belt, not with flames, but with strain. Heat, drought, salt intrusion, crop damage, transport stress, and the slow realization that food vulnerability is not abstract when the land itself begins to fail. But he returned again and again to one idea. No region would suffer in isolation. In one state, people would still be watching disaster on television as if it belonged to somewhere else. In another, hospitals would already be overcrowded. In another, roads would be washed out. In another, power instability would begin changing everyday behavior. The country would be living inside multiple realities at once. And that, Hale believed, would be one of the hardest things for Americans to accept. The danger would not feel national at first. It would feel local, fragmented, unmanageable, until the pattern became undeniable. By then, the real crisis would no longer be whether one county or one city had been hit. It would be whether the national system still had the emotional and logistical strength to respond coherently at scale. Hale feared something more than weather. He feared confusion. Not confusion as inconvenience, but confusion as a weapon. In every era, frightened populations search for certainty. And in the digital era, certainty is cheap to manufacture. A confident liar can move faster than an honest official. A dramatic falsehood can travel farther than a measured truth. By the time a correction arrives, emotion has already chosen its side. That is why Hale believed information collapse would be one of the most dangerous features of any 2026 emergency. People would not simply need water, onto medicine, fuel, and roads. They would need clarity. Where is the safe route? Which shelter is real? Which alert is authentic? Who is coordinating aid? Who is exploiting fear? A desperate family with a dead phone and a paper map may be in less danger than a family with full battery, endless notifications, and no way to tell truth from manipulation. Hale warned of fake convoys, false safe zones, opportunistic influencers, panic-driven groupthink, and digital prophets selling emotional certainty to frighten people who no longer trusted institutions. In that environment, misinformation would not remain online. It would move bodies, redirect traffic, send families into danger, and turn neighbors against one another. This was the hidden fracture line. Not just whether the power stayed on, whether the public mind stayed intact. Because once people no longer know what is true, every house becomes an island. Every stranger becomes a threat. Every door becomes defensive. And society begins to lose the invisible fabric that makes survival collective instead of savage. For Hale, that was the point at which America would discover what kind of country it really was. Hale spoke often about what he called the first 72 hours. Not because every disaster follows that exact timeline, but because the opening window of crisis reveals character faster than ideology ever can. He urged people to stop fantasizing about cinematic survival and start thinking practically. Not bunkers, not luxury panic rooms, not theatrical stockpiles built for ego, discipline, water, dry food, medicine, batteries, light, paper copies of numbers and routes. A small bag prepared for motion, not for fantasy. A plan simple enough to follow under stress. He believed the greatest difference between people who endure and people who collapse is rarely intelligence. It is emotional order. Families who have discussed what to do. Parents who can explain calmly instead of panicking loudly. Neighbors who know one another's names before the crisis begins. Households that understand the difference between staying too long and fleeing too late. In Hale's view, preparation was not paranoia. It was moral seriousness. Because when a crisis hits, your decisions do not affect only you. They affect children, elders, the injured, the isolated, and the people who may end up depending on your steadiness. Readiness, then, becomes a form of responsibility. He also said something many people disliked. Money is useful in a functioning system. Character is useful when the system falters. A wealthy, disorganized person can fail faster than a modest family with clarity, restraint, and trust. Expensive comfort is not the same as resilience. And in hard times, the illusion of safety often burns away first. That is when people discover what in their lives was real, and what only looked strong while the lights were still on. One of Hale's favorite lines appeared in his notebooks over and over. Fire does not destroy gold. It reveals what was never gold to begin with. He applied that not just to individuals, but to institutions, communities, and nations. A crisis, he argued, does not create character out of nowhere. It exposes it. It reveals whether a marriage is built on loyalty or convenience, whether a neighborhood is a true community or merely a row of adjacent properties, whether leaders can still tell the truth under pressure, whether institutions exist to serve the public or merely to preserve themselves. The same is true for a country. America, in Hale's interpretation, has long wrapped itself in stories of strength, wealth, freedom, technological superiority, global reach, military dominance, cultural influence. Some of those strengths are real. But if the nation has become morally exhausted, spiritually hollow, and emotionally dependent on spectacle, then a hard season will do more than damage infrastructure. It will strip illusion. It will show whether people still know how to sacrifice, share, repair, endure, and rebuild together. No. Hale did not romanticize suffering. He was not celebrating collapse. He was warning that every society eventually faces a filter, a period in which its performances stop working and only its underlying truth remains. That truth may be ugly at first. Arrogance may fall. False expertise may fail. Predators may surface. Comfort may disappear. But he believed something else would surface too. The people who can still carry water, repair roofs, check on elders, share food, calm children, and tell the truth without theatrics. In every age, civilizations survive because ordinary people choose usefulness over panic. That, he said, is where renewal begins. Hale's most controversial argument had nothing to do with maps or logistics. It was spiritual. He believed that nations accumulate consequences the same way individuals do. Not in a simplistic, mechanical sense, but through habits repeated across generations, greed rewarded, truth punished, vanity exalted, dependence normalized, cruelty rationalized, and moral language hollowed out until it means almost nothing. In that reading, crisis is not random punishment from the sky. It is the moment when a long-ignored imbalance becomes visible. Again, this should be treated as speculation, not fact. But Hale insisted that America's deepest danger was neither foreign attack nor financial downturn. It was moral confusion, the inability to distinguish freedom from appetite, information from manipulation, power from wisdom, faith from branding, and comfort from meaning. A society can remain rich while becoming spiritually poor. It can praise liberty while losing inner freedom. It can celebrate itself while slowly becoming incapable of honesty. And when such a society is shaken, the question it faces is not merely how to survive materially. It is whether it wants to become worthy of survival. Hale rejected the fantasy of a lone savior descending to rescue a passive public. He believed renewal would come, if it came at all, through millions of small acts of conscience, restraint instead of frenzy, mercy instead of contempt, courage instead of performance, truth instead of soothing lies. In other words, the test of 2026 would not be passed by those with the loudest voices. It would be passed by those who still know how to remain human under pressure. That was his prophecy, if one chooses to call it that. So what is the end of Hale's warning? Not annihilation, responsibility. See, he never described a glorious escape for the few or a theatrical ending for the many. He described a filter, a harsh passage, a season in which systems may fail, masks may burn away, and people may be forced to confront what in their lives was substance and what was performance. After that, he said, a different kind of future becomes possible. Not shinier, not louder, not more luxurious, but more honest. A country with less glitter and more humility. Less spectacle and more service. Less obsession with image and more reverence for what actually sustains life. Trust, discipline, skill, faith, mercy, local bonds, practical wisdom. In his final lectures, Hale asked a question that made audiences uncomfortable. When the systems fail, what remains in you that can still build, protect, and guide? Not what you can purchase, not what you can post, not what you can signal, what remains. Can you calm a room? Can you tell truth under pressure? Can you share when you are afraid? Can you help repair what fear has damaged? Can you be steady enough for someone else to survive beside you? That is where the story ends, not with guaranteed doom, not with guaranteed deliverance, but with a choice. If 2026 becomes a year of pressure, then pressure will reveal us. It will reveal the country. It will reveal the household. It will reveal the heart. And perhaps that has always been the real warning. The future does not only happen to a nation answers it.